Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a significant document you, our listener, have brought to our attention. Project 2025's Mandate for Leadership.
Yeah, this is a really expansive piece of work.
It really is. It outlines potential policy shifts across numerous government agencies. Everything from the structure of the White House itself to the specifics of international development, agriculture, education, national security, various regulatory bodies. It's a lot.
It is. So our mission today really is to navigate these excerpts you've provided and pull out the most significant proposals.
Right, the ones that could really reshape how the government operates, potentially.
Absolutely. And the sheer breadth of this material, it just underscores how comprehensively the authors have considered potential changes.
For sure. So for this deep dive, we're going to concentrate on the core themes that emerge.
And the proposals that strike us as having the most potential to alter the direction of policy, right?
Exactly. And, it's important to understand the context here. This mandate for leadership, it has a history.
It does. It originated with the Heritage Foundation back during the Reagan administration.
And there's this claim that many of its recommendations were ultimately adopted as policy.
Which is why people pay attention to this current one.
Precisely. So by examining this current document, we might gain, some valuable insight into the priorities of a significant part of the conservative movement.
And potentially a future administration. Okay, so where do we start?
Let's unpack this, starting right at the very top. The proposed structure of the White House.
Okay. What's truly insightful here is the strong emphasis placed on the Chief of Staff.
Centralizing, it seems.
Very much. The document envisions this role as absolutely central to implementing the president's vision. They advocate for a very streamlined organizational chart.
Simple, clear lines of authority.
Right. It's not just about drawing boxes on a chart, though.
No, what's the significance of this push for a more streamlined structure?
Well, what's truly insightful here, I think, is the potential for this to centralize power significantly in the Chief of Staff's office.
Historically, administrations with a really strong Chief of Staff have seen maybe faster implementation.
They have, but also risks, information bottlenecks, maybe a less diverse range of voices reaching the president.
That makes sense. And building on that sort of centralized view, the document also has some specific ideas about the White House counsel.
The president's top lawyer.
Right. It stresses the need for someone deeply committed both to the president's agenda and to affording the president proactive counsel and zealous representation.
That wording is pretty strong. Zealous representation.
It sounds like they're looking for a very particular kind of alignment there.
That's a critical point, and it raises a real tension, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, while a politically aligned counsel might be really effective in advancing the president's agenda,
sure,
there's also a risk, potentially, of compromising the independent legal advice a president needs, especially in challenging situations. What are your thoughts on that potential trade-off?
It certainly highlights that balancing act, between loyalty and objective counsel. It's tricky. Okay, let's talk about the Office of Legislative Affairs, or OLA.
Right, dealing with Congress.
The document emphasizes the need for a unified message heading to Capitol Hill.
So no rogue White House actors freelancing on the Hill, it seems.
Pretty much. And OLA isn't just about, schmoozing lawmakers. They want them involved in policy discussions and even budget reviews early on.
That's key, I think. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests a very centralized approach to dealing with Congress. Controlling
the narrative.
Exactly. The White House wants to control the narrative, ensure everyone is on the same page regarding legislative priorities, and that involvement in budget reviews.
What about it?
It also indicates a desire for fiscal alignment with the president's overall agenda right from the start.
Got it. Then there's the policy councils, the NSC, NEC, DPC.
National Security Council, National Economic Council, Domestic Policy Council.
Yeah, they get significant attention too. Positioned as crucial for helping the president manage the sprawling executive branch.
And keep everyone aligned with White House priorities.
Yeah.
Policy coordination is their main job.
Making sure all the relevant offices are in the loop and disagreements get escalated to the president when necessary.
Exactly. These councils are designed to be the engines of policy development and coordination across the administration.
How so?
Well, the process they describe emphasizes thorough discussion of different viewpoints. But ultimately, it aims to present the president with well-structured options for decision-making when consensus can't be reached.
And the vice president.
The VP. The traditional roles are mentioned: leading administration efforts, breaking tie votes in the Senate.
Being a brand ambassador.
Right. It seems like a pretty standard view of the VP's function, for the most part.
For the most part.
Yes. The document acknowledges the VP's traditional utility. But the real shift, it seems to me, comes with the National Security Council.
Okay, what about the NSC?
There's a clear proposal to align NSC staff much more directly with the president's national security goals.
How?
They're talking about accountable senior officials, potentially political appointees or politically vetted detailees, reporting directly to political staff.
Those proposals for the NSC seem particularly noteworthy. Could you elaborate on the implications of shifting staff alignment like that?
Well, what's fascinating here is the clear intention to ensure that the day-to-day workings of the NSC are driven by individuals who are deeply aligned with the president's specific national security vision.
So a more unified foreign policy, maybe?
Could be. More unified, maybe more decisive. But it also raises questions about potentially sidelining dissenting expert opinions within the NSC structure itself.
A potential downside. Okay, the National Economic Council, the NSC, they also have some specific expertise they're looking for.
Right. Taxes, energy, tech, healthcare, all the big ones.
And they specifically mention this expertise needs to reflect current pressing issues.
Which makes sense.
And the NEC's role goes beyond just advising. They're also seen as key in White House messaging on the economy.
And even vetting appointments to financial regulatory agencies. That part stood out.
Why?
Well, the explicit mention of wanting appointees to financial regulatory agencies who share the president's policy priorities.
That sounds pretty direct.
It signals a clear intention to ensure the leadership of these agencies aligns with the administration's economic agenda, which, could lead to significant shifts in regulatory approaches.
Makes sense. And then there's the Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP.
Right. The proposal is to actually elevate the OSTP director, give them more prominence, maybe formally, maybe informally.
And the idea behind that?
The idea seems to be to balance out the agendas of other agencies and bring technical expertise to regulatory matters, especially with the support of OMB, the Budget Office.
So potentially a stronger voice for science?
It could be a significant move, yeah. If there's a perception that scientific input within agencies has been overshadowed by political considerations, elevating the OSTP director could provide a more direct channel for independent scientific advice to the highest levels.
Okay, let's shift gears. Let's talk about bureaucratic reform and the people who actually make up the federal workforce.
The bureaucracy itself, yes.
The document certainly raises concerns about the current state of it, touching on criticisms of merit-based hiring and compensation.
They point to backlogs at places like the MSPB and EEOC.
The Merit Systems Protection Board and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Right, and they argue that the time and paperwork involved actually discourage managers from addressing poor performance.
So this section highlights a core tension, doesn't it?
It does. On one hand, you have these criticisms about the efficiency and effectiveness of the federal bureaucracy. The backlogs are cited as evidence of a system that can be cumbersome, slow to address performance issues.
But then we see a contrast in the findings on federal employee compensation.
Yeah, that's interesting.
The document itself references a Heritage Foundation study claiming federal employees are actually overpaid compared to similar private sector workers.
Well, an AEI study also found a pay and total compensation premium.
But, official studies often claim the opposite. It feels like there are dueling sets of data being presented here.
That's a crucial point. And the debate over federal employee compensation, it's a long-standing one, right? Different methodologies can yield different results.
So where does this document land?
It clearly leans towards the view that federal compensation is higher than in the private sector, and that view definitely informs their recommendations for reform.
And one of the key proposals here is to give the president direct supervision of the bureaucracy with the OPM director in the cabinet.
The Office of Personnel Management Director.
Right. And the phrase personnel as policy is specifically emphasized. This sounds like a very direct assertion of presidential control over the civil service.
Absolutely. Elevating the OPM director to the cabinet level, that would send a strong signal about the importance of personnel management in achieving the president's policy objectives.
The underlying philosophy seems to be
that the right people in the right positions are essential for effective governance. Personnel is policy.
There's also a proposal to shift security clearance investigations for the civilian workforce back from the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency, DCSA.
Back to OPM.
Exactly. This is framed as correcting a wrong-headed decision that essentially gave the Department of Defense control over civilian managers.
This is an interesting bit of bureaucratic reorganization. The rationale they provide is that the transfer of this function to DCSA, which happened after the big OPM data breach,
Right, I remember that.
it created an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy and, in their view, an inappropriate level of DoD influence over the civilian workforce.
So bringing it back to OPM, except for military clearances, is presented as a way to streamline the process.
That's the idea. Streamline it, put it back under civilian personnel management.
Okay, let's move on to national security and foreign policy. This gets a significant amount of attention in the document.
Unsurprisingly.
The military threat from China is front and center, particularly concerning Taiwan and the first island chain.
The document calls for a denial defense.
A denial defense. Explain that.
Essentially, this strategy focuses on making an invasion of Taiwan so costly and difficult for China that they'd be deterred from even attempting it.
How?
It involves specific military capabilities and deployments aimed at preventing a successful amphibious landing and occupation, making it prohibitively difficult, as they say.
Got it. They also want to elevate the defense intelligence enterprise's voice in national policy discussions.
The DIAE, arguing that its 75% share of the intelligence community budget warrants greater influence.
And on the military side itself,
There's a call for a two-war force defense strategy for the Air Force and, well, increased defense spending overall.
elevating the DIAE's voice. What does that really imply?
It suggests a desire to ensure that defense intelligence perspectives, which often focus on military capabilities and threats, are given, due weight in policy formulation.
Maybe alongside or even independent of broader intelligence assessments?
Potentially, alongside or independent of all source intelligence assessments that consider a wider range of factors. And the two-war force strategy, the bigger Air Force budget, that aligns with the focus on being prepared for simultaneous major conflicts.
Right. Now, irregular warfare is proposed as a cornerstone of security strategy.
But they're defining it really broadly.
Yeah, to include things like economic warfare and disinformation.
Which suggests a recognition that threats to national security aren't just military in nature anymore.
How significant is that expansion?
Expanding the definition of irregular warfare to encompass economic and informational threats is, I think, a pretty significant development.
Why?
It acknowledges the multifaceted ways state and non-state actors can challenge U.S. interests using tools beyond traditional military force.
And it calls for a more integrated response.
A more integrated whole-of-government approach to countering these threats.
Exactly. China's nuclear expansion isn't ignored either.
No, there's a note about needing to account for it and considering procuring more modernized nuclear systems.
What's the concern there?
It reflects the concern that China's rapidly growing nuclear arsenal could alter the strategic balance, potentially creating a situation of mutual vulnerability.
So the suggestion to procure more modernized systems
Indicates a potential shift towards a more robust nuclear deterrent posture in response.
Okay. What about international organizations, the UN, WHO, etc.?
Well, the objective seems to be either using them to promote American interests or, well, taking steps to withdraw.
That sounds like a very transactional view of these bodies.
That's a key takeaway, I think. The document expresses a skepticism toward international organizations and a preference for either leveraging them to advance U.S. goals.
Or disengaging if they're seen as hindering those goals, or operating contrary to American interests.
Pretty much. Restoring international broadcasting infrastructure like Voice of America and engaging in cyber diplomacy are also highlighted as important tools.
These points underscore the enduring importance of information and the growing significance of cyberspace in international relations today.
So, restoring broadcasting suggests
a renewed focus on public diplomacy, countering adversarial narratives in the information space.
And cyber diplomacy.
That recognizes the need to address threats and establish norms in the digital realm through international engagement.
The Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, is also in the spotlight.
Yes, the proposal is to empower the DNI to effectively oversee the entire intelligence community.
Including budget and personnel authority?
Including budget and personnel authority. This is framed as essential for implementing the President's intelligence priorities.
This seems like a recurring theme, doesn't it? Centralizing authority. It is. Centralizing authority to ensure alignment with the president's agenda. Strengthening the DNI's authority over budget and personnel within the IC is seen as crucial for improving coordination, efficiency, and responsiveness across the intelligence apparatus.
There's also an interesting idea for the IC to adopt an obligation to share policy for cyber defense intelligence.
Right, with rapid release of technical indicators.
That sounds like a move towards greater transparency and collaboration in cybersecurity.
It's a significant proposal. The idea is to make sharing cyber threat intelligence the default, kind of like the duty to warn in counterterrorism.
Which could enhance collective defense.
Potentially, yeah. By ensuring critical information about emerging threats and vulnerabilities gets disseminated quickly to those who need it to protect their systems.
What about the U.S. Agency for Global Media, USAGM?
Its mission, according to the document, is to present the truth about America and American policy, not parrot America's adversaries' propaganda.
So, a call for a more assertive, clearly defined role.
It seems like it. The emphasis is on projecting a positive and accurate image of the United States and actively countering what they perceive as hostile narratives and disinformation from other nations.
Which aligns with the broader focus on information warfare and public diplomacy we just talked about.
Exactly. Key tools of statecraft in their view.
Finally, in this section, they raise concerns about China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
And its geostrategic implications, suggesting this is a major challenge that needs a response.
How's BRI viewed in the document?
It's viewed as a key tool for China to expand its global economic and political influence, potentially at the expense of the United States and its allies.
So, highlighting this concern signals
A desire for a more robust and coordinated strategy to counter China's growing economic and geopolitical power.
Okay, let's shift our focus now to domestic policy, specifically looking at some agency-specific proposals, starting with USAID, the Agency for International Development.
Okay, USAID. The document proposes a pretty significant shift here,
How so?
calling for a cessation of the war on fossil fuels in developing countries, rescinding climate policies and foreign aid.
And instead,
There's a focus on religious freedom, defunding global abortion efforts by expanding the Mexico City policy.
and emphasizing traditional family structures in global health initiatives,
This represents a fundamental reorientation of USAID's priorities, really.
moving away from climate
Towards religious freedom and traditional family structures, it reflects a distinct ideological orientation. And expanding the Mexico City policy.
which prohibits U.S. funding for foreign NGOs involved in abortion services or promotion.
Right, expanding that would have significant global implications for access to reproductive health care.
And it doesn't stop there, does it?
No. The recommendation is to remove terms like gender equality, reproductive health, and LGBTQ+ from USAID materials.
And dismantle the agency's DEI apparatus altogether.
That's the proposal. Dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts within the agency.
That signals a clear intent to redefine the scope of USAID's work.
Definitely. Moving away from what are perceived as progressive social agendas and focusing on a more narrowly defined set of priorities. And eliminating DEI efforts would also be a significant organizational and cultural shift.
Okay, let's move to the Department of Agriculture, USDA.
All right, USDA.
The desire here seems to be to shift away from using the USDA to, quote, transform the food system.
Instead, the emphasis is on respecting farmers and efficient agricultural production.
They're calling to eliminate marketing orders and checkoff programs. Can you remind us what those are?
Sure. Marketing orders are these agreements that can control the supply, quality, price of certain farm commodities. Checkoff programs are industry-funded marketing and research initiatives, like Got Milk, perhaps.
Got it. So eliminating those.
The USDA proposals reflect a desire to reduce federal intervention in agriculture, prioritize market-based solutions.
Less regulation, more free market.
That seemed to be the belief. Also ensuring federal conservation programs address specific environmental concerns with measurable goals.
And reforming SNAP eligibility. That's the food stamp program.
Right. Specifically, preventing individuals from qualifying just by receiving a pamphlet from TANF, the welfare program.
Which aligns with that broader theme of reducing reliance on government assistance.
Correct.
Active management of forests to reduce wildfire risk is also highlighted at USDA.
Which seems like a pretty direct and practical approach, given the increasing wildfire threats.
Focus on things like controlled burns, thinning vegetation.
Exactly. A pragmatic approach aimed at mitigating risks, protecting resources and communities.
Okay, over at the Department of Education, what's the focus there?
The goal seems to be advancing education freedom.
Meaning?
Things like portability of federal funds, letting money follow the student, and tax credits for education savings accounts. School choice, basically.
And they want to streamline federal education programs.
Into block grants to states, and limit the federal involvement mostly to just statistics gathering.
So more state and local control.
That's the idea. Block grants give states more flexibility. Limiting the federal role reflects that belief in state and local control over education.
They also want to rescind regulations, adding a non-binary sex category in OCR data collection.
The Office for Civil Rights.
Restore due process in Title IX proceedings.
Related to sexual misconduct allegations.
And restore parental consent regarding gender transition, all framed around restoring the rights of women and girls.
These proposals definitely reflect a focus on defining sex in traditional binary terms and emphasizing parental rights in decisions related to gender identity in schools.
And the changes to Title IX.
Those could have significant implications for how allegations of sexual misconduct are handled in schools and colleges, particularly concerning the rights of the accused. Restoring due process is the stated goal there.
And for IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act.
The proposal is to update it to allow families to use funds for a wider range of educational expenses.
More flexibility for families of children with disabilities.
Seems to be the goal. Access a wider range of services and resources. And also, pursuing antitrust action against college accreditors.
Antitrust against accreditors. Why?
It suggests a desire to increase competition and potentially lower the cost of higher education by challenging the power of these kind of gatekeeping organizations.
Interesting. Okay. Department of Energy, DOE.
A shift in focus here, too. Particularly for one office, DSAS, Department of Energy Security and Assessment.
Towards what?
Towards energy infrastructure security and promoting U.S. energy resources internationally rather than focusing on decarbonization.
So less climate focus, more traditional energy security.
And promoting domestic resources. Also securing American interests in the Arctic and protecting emerging technologies from theft are key points.
This really represents a significant reorientation of DOE's priorities, doesn't it?
It does. Emphasis shifts from climate change mitigation and renewables to securing existing energy infrastructure and promoting domestic fossil fuels globally. The Arctic and tech protection fit broader national security concerns.
Advancing the licensing process for Yucca Mountain for nuclear waste disposal is also mentioned.
Yeah, and updating and reinvigorating the U.S. nuclear arsenal is on the agenda for DOE, too.
Addressing Yucca Mountain. That's been debated for decades.
It has. Crucial for the long-term viability of nuclear power in the U.S. And updating the arsenal reflects that national security focus on maintaining a credible deterrent.
They also want to limit the impact of subsidized renewables on price formation.
And reform reserve margin calculations in the energy sector.
Can you explain reserve margins for listeners less familiar with the energy sector? What's the significance of reforming them?
Sure. Reserve margins refer to the extra power generation capacity utilities keep on hand above expected peak demand to ensure the grid stays reliable.
Like a safety cushion.
Exactly.
Okay.
Reforming how those calculations are done could impact how much backup power is required. That, in turn, could affect the integration of intermittent renewables, like wind and solar, and potentially the overall cost of electricity.
Got it. Let's move to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency.
Okay, EPA. The desire here is for risk-based chemical evaluations, but with a narrower scope.
And there are criticisms leveled at the EPA's scientific enterprise.
Yes, criticisms that it's too precautionary, maybe politically driven.
So what's proposed?
Reforming EPA advisory bodies to ensure more balanced perspectives, they say, and ensuring regulations are based on transparent, reproducible science.
These EPA proposals seem to reflect a desire for a more industry-friendly regulatory environment.
That's a fair assessment. The emphasis on risk-based evaluations, narrower scope, transparent science, it suggests a belief that current EPA regulations are overly burdensome and maybe not always based on the most rigorous scientific standards.
Rejecting funds for unauthorized programs like IRIS is also mentioned. What's IRIS?
IRIS is the EPA's Integrated Risk Information System. It's a database of human health effects from exposure to environmental contaminants.
So defunding that and revisiting outdated environmental statutes like the Global Change Research Act of 1990.
These actions would aim to limit the EPA's authority and scope in assessing and regulating environmental risks. It could potentially lead to a rollback of certain environmental protections and research efforts.
Okay, HHS, Health and Human Services.
A big one. Focus here on protecting life, conscience, and bodily integrity.
Which translates to
Reversing approvals of chemical abortion drugs, protecting conscience rights for healthcare providers.
They even propose splitting the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Yes, into two entities. One for data gathering, another for policy recommendations.
Why split it?
It highlights concerns about the agency's dual roles, suggests a desire to separate these functions, maybe to ensure objectivity in both public health data collection and policy advice.
There's also mention of creating a research agenda supporting pro-life policies.
Yes, and concerns are raised about conflicts of interest at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, related to industry ties and patents.
Along with proposed reforms to Medicare and Medicaid.
Right. Including making Medicare Advantage the default option for beneficiaries and increasing flexibility in benefit design for both programs.
And defunding abortion providers is also a stated goal here.
It is.
And in a notable point, they want to prioritize mental health and substance abuse issues over housing first policies at HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Right. Housing first is an approach to homelessness that prioritizes providing immediate housing, then addressing other needs like addiction or mental health.
So this proposal suggests a shift.
It suggests a shift towards requiring individuals to address mental health and substance abuse issues as a prerequisite for housing assistance, potentially.
Okay, Department of Homeland Security, DHS.
DHS would see consolidated external communications functions.
Meaning?
Political appointees in the Office of Legislative Affairs, OLA, would become the primary point of contact with Congress on all inquiries. Budget and appropriation staff would move into legislative affairs offices.
More centralized control over messaging to Congress again.
Seems like it. There's also a strong emphasis on IC immigration and customs enforcement, fully utilizing detention space.
Limiting the use of alternatives to detention, or ATD, and parole.
And operationalizing Blackie's warrants for worksite enforcement.
Blackie's warrants. I'm not familiar with that term. Could you explain it in this context?
It's a term sometimes used, maybe informally, to refer to ICE operations specifically targeting employers who hire undocumented workers. The proposal suggests a significant increase in these types of worksite enforcement actions.
Got it. The document also expresses concern that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is overtasked.
Yes, and wants a greater emphasis on state and local preparedness for disasters.
So shifting responsibility.
It suggests a desire to shift more responsibility for disaster preparedness and response back to state and local governments. FEMA might then focus more on providing support for truly catastrophic events that overwhelm local capabilities.
Right. Moving to the Department of Justice, DOJ.
The focus here would be on restoring values of independence and impartiality, addressing perceived politicization.
And applying the rule of law evenly is the claim.
Right. Also prioritizing immigration enforcement, including prosecuting immigration offenses.
And they want to eliminate racial classifications and critical race theory trainings within the DOJ.
That's stated as an objective, yes. The DOJ proposals aim to depoliticize the department, prioritize traditional law enforcement, especially immigration. The stance on racial classifications in CRT trainings reflects a specific ideological viewpoint on those issues in legal and training contexts.
Department of Labor, DOL. What's the plan there?
Establishing a safe harbor for companies offering independent workers access to benefits.
Like gig workers.
Exactly.
Well,
And protecting the franchise business model from an expansive definition of joint employer.
which could make franchisors liable for franchise labor practices.
Correct. There's also a push for union transparency,
How so?
requiring government unions to file the same kind of detailed financial information as private sector unions already do.
Okay. Department of Transportation, DOT.
Focus on making air travel more affordable and abundant, increasing safety and competition.
And removing obstacles to emerging aviation technologies like drones or advanced air mobility, perhaps?
Potentially. Also, potential support for joint ventures by smaller airlines. Reforming the FAA, particularly air traffic control, is mentioned.
And moving away from using the Highway Trust Fund to subsidize mass transit.
Right. The DOT proposals prioritize deregulation, competition in airlines. Reforming the FAA and limiting federal subsidies for mass transit reflect that desire for a more market-driven transportation sector.
Department of Veterans Affairs, VA.
Here, the proposal is to rescind clinical policy directives contrary to conservative governance,
Starting with
abortion services and gender reassignment surgery offered through the VA.
aligns with themes we saw elsewhere.
It does. They also want to focus on the effects of shifting veteran demographics and conduct an independent audit of the VA, and increase the use of certain senior executive service positions.
Okay. Department of Commerce.
commerce sees differing perspectives internally on trade policy.
Between what?
Between lowering tariffs to make goods more affordable versus using trade policy more aggressively to support American manufacturing and national security.
But there are consistent concerns.
Yes, concerns about technology transfer to adversaries like China and protecting intellectual property.
Anything else under commerce?
They propose fully commercializing the National Weather Service's forecasting operations.
Privatizing weather forecasts.
Fully commercializing, yes. And reevaluating all decennial census questions.
Reevaluating every question on the census. Wow. Okay, Department of the Treasury.
Treasury's goal: develop and promote tax reform legislation.
Aimed at
Improving incentives to work, save, and invest. How? By reducing marginal tax rates and the cost of capital. Also, simplifying the tax system and promoting tax competition between states or even nations.
So, classic conservative tax policy goals.
Pretty much. Lower marginal rates, reduce cost of capital, simpler system for economic growth. Concerns about the Bank Secrecy Act's impact on financial privacy are also noted.
Suggesting a desire for greater individual financial freedom.
In financial transactions, yes.
What about the Export-Import Bank, EXIM?
EXIM. The document presents arguments both for and against it.
The classic debate.
Exactly. Criticisms of it as government-granted privilege benefiting large corporations.
Versus the counter-argument that export credit financing is a critical tool for macroeconomic growth and, importantly, countering China's influence.
It acknowledges that long-standing debate about the role of government in export financing.
The Federal Reserve, what's proposed for the Fed?
Proposals to limit the Fed's balance sheet purchases strictly to U.S. Treasuries.
Wind down its existing balance sheet over time.
And even explore commodity backing the dollar as an alternative to current monetary policy, like a gold standard or similar.
Wow, commodity backing, that's a big idea.
It is. Concerns about political pressure influencing Fed decisions are also raised. The overall thrust is to limit the central bank's power and scope, focusing it more narrowly on traditional monetary policy, like controlling inflation.
Exploring commodity backing the dollar would be a massive departure.
Huge implications for the global financial system.
Small Business Administration, SBA.
Call to reform the Small Business Investment Company, SBIC program, to favor capital-intense investments in small manufacturers. Also, modernizing small business size standards.
So targeting support.
Seems like it. Targeting support to specific types of small businesses seen as crucial for growth and innovation, especially manufacturing and those needing significant capital.
Federal Communications Commission, FCC.
The FCC is called upon to ensure internet companies moderate content in good faith.
Addressing concerns about bias and content moderation.
That seems to be the implication. And also to address national security threats posed by Chinese companies like Huawei and TikTok.
And on the economic side.
Unleash economic prosperity by freeing more airwaves, more spectrum for wireless connectivity, and streamlining permitting for infrastructure like cell towers.
Got it. Finally, the Federal Election Commission, FEC.
The FEC faces scrutiny over its bipartisan structure, which often leads to gridlock.
So what's the proposal?
To direct the DOJ to only prosecute clear violations of the Federal Election Campaign Act, FECA.
And to defend the FEC in litigation when the commissioners themselves fail to authorize their own counsel due to deadlock.
Right. It highlights the challenges of bipartisan governance in a politically charged area and suggests a desire for more decisive enforcement, potentially through greater DOJ involvement.
Okay. Wow, that was a lot of agency specifics. So as we look across all these proposals, some overarching themes really emerge, don't they?
They really do.
We see a consistent desire, I think, to reduce the scope and intervention of the federal government.
Absolutely. Emphasizing individual responsibility, free market principles. That's a core ideological thread running through so many of these recommendations.
Limiting government's role in the economy, in society.
Promoting a greater reliance on individual initiative and market forces.
We also see potentially significant shifts in policy related to social issues, abortion, gender identity, family structures.
And this would play out both domestically and in international aid, as we saw with USAID.
Right. These proposals reflect a socially conservative worldview. They could lead to substantial changes in areas like reproductive rights, LGBTQ+ issues, the definition of family and government policies.
Both within the U.S. and in how American foreign aid is directed. Definitely.
And the strong focus on countering China's influence is just undeniable.
Across economic, military, technological domains. It seems to be a central organizing principle for many of the national security and foreign policy recommendations.
The perception of China as a major strategic and economic competitor is a huge driver here.
It really is, indicating a desire for a more assertive, competitive stance towards Beijing on multiple fronts.
And finally, there's that clear emphasis on executive action.
And the appointment of political loyalists to implement the president's agenda across the bureaucracy. Personnel is policy.
It underscores the importance placed on presidential control, the belief that a committed executive branch, staffed by people aligned with the president's vision, is essential to turn these proposals into reality. Now, it's important to note, external analysis has pointed out potential inconsistencies within this mandate.
Right, and that Project 2025 isn't the only conservative group developing these kinds of policy playbooks.
There's also been that interesting dynamic with the Trump campaign, hasn't there?
Yeah, trying to distance itself publicly from some of the more discussed ideas.
While also showing clear ties to the Heritage Foundation and individuals involved in creating this very document.
It's a critical point. The relationship between Project 2025 and a potential future administration is, well, complex and dynamic. Despite any public distancing, the deep connections and shared personnel suggest a strong potential for these proposals to inform policy decisions.
And we can't forget those expansion sections from that other document you shared, the global impacts one.
Right, those really spell out a further tightening of the Mexico City policy.
Potentially applying it even to U.S.-based international NGOs and their recipients.
That's the proposal, which could have huge global implications for sexual and reproductive health access.
And there's that continued push to eliminate terms related to gender and LGBTQ plus issues from USI programming.
And dismantle DEI efforts even further within the agency.
These expansion proposals really illustrate a clear intent to amplify that socially conservative agenda globally.
Potentially impacting a wide range of organizations and individuals in international development and health, significantly reducing access to comprehensive sexual and reproductive health care services worldwide.
So to wrap things up, this deep dive into Project 2025's mandate for leadership really highlights the significant scope and, well, the potential impact of these proposals.
It really does. It touches nearly every aspect of the federal government.
And signals a very clear direction for potential policy shifts.
Indeed. And what we've explored today is just a focused look at the material you provided. There are many other facets within these documents that deserve further scrutiny to fully understand the potential ramifications.
Absolutely. And that brings us to our final thought for you, our listener. Considering the historical context of past mandate for leadership documents and the sheer scale of the proposals we've discussed today, what single proposed shift do you believe would have the most far-reaching consequences on the relationship between the citizen and the federal government, and why?
It's a good question to ponder.
We encourage you to really reflect on how these interconnected policy ideas could reshape the landscape of American governance. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.